Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Today we're packing our pickaxes and a regrettable amount of optimism to travel back to 1849 California. We're going to sift through the mud, misery, and rampant disease to uncover why the life of a gold rush prospector wasn't just a tough gamble. It was a masterclass in comprehensive suffering that absolutely, unequivocally, sucked. You've seen him in paintings, read his story in dime novels, maybe even seen a sanitized version of him in a sepia-toned photograph. He is the California 49er, the prospector, a figure of rugged individualism, his jaw set, his flannel shirt artfully dirtied, a trusty pickaxe slung over a broad shoulder. He stands against the majestic backdrop of the Sierra Nevadas, a lone wolf silhouetted against a golden sunset, the master of his own destiny. He is the very embodiment of the American dream, a man who, through sheer grit and determination, plucks a fortune from the earth and forges a new life from raw, glittering gold. And in a way, you can't blame anyone for buying into the fantasy. There was something genuinely, breathtakingly audacious about it. The news, when it finally broke in the East, was like a thunderclap. Gold. Not in some far-flung mythical land, but in America, just lying there in the beds of rivers, waiting to be picked up. For a generation of farmers, clerks, factory hands, and restless young men choking on the dust of their predetermined lives, this wasn't just news. It was a divine proclamation. It was a chance to leapfrog over the rigid social and economic structures of the old world. To become a king in your own right with nothing but a shovel and a strong back. The sheer, intoxicating pull of that idea was a force of nature in itself. To pack up everything you owned, to say goodbye to everyone you knew, and to trek 2,000 miles across a hostile continent or sail halfway around the world on a stinking crowded ship. That required a kind of hope so profound it bordered on madness. It was, for a fleeting moment, a beautiful and awe-inspiring display of human ambition. But let's be perfectly, brutally clear. Trust me, being a real 49er was nothing like that romantic painting. It was a filthy, desperate, disease-ridden, and profoundly disappointing ordeal. The journey there was designed to strip you of your humanity, and the destination was designed to strip you of your dignity, your health, and whatever meager savings you had left. The gold wasn't glittering in the sun. It was microscopic flakes buried under tons of frigid, muddy gravel. Your fellow prospectors weren't noble brothers in arms. They were suspicious, starving, and occasionally homicidal rivals. And the grand, majestic wilderness. It was a combination of an open sewer and a graveyard. Being a prospector in 1849 was backbreaking, mind-numbing, soul-crushing work, and for the vast, overwhelming majority of men who lived it, it profoundly, utterly, and categorically sucked. Before we wade neck-deep into that mire, if you appreciate this particular brand of historical deep diving, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. It's the single best way to support the channel and ensure more of these miserable and important histories get told. And as we go, if you can think of a worse get-rich-quick scheme in history that people actually fell for, let me know down in the comments. I'm always taking notes. Now, go ahead and find a comfortable spot. Maybe pour yourself a glass of clean, potable water. A true luxury our 49er would have probably traded a suspicious-looking gold nugget for without a second thought. Settle in and prepare to journey with us into the cold, muddy waters of the American River, where dreams went to die, and dysentery was just a part of the daily routine. Let's get started. Our 49er wasn't born into the life of a prospector. No one was. You weren't dredged up into the noble, mud-caked lineage of gold panners. There was no family pickaxe passed down through the generations, no ancestral claim waiting for you. That's because the life of a California gold rush prospector wasn't a trade. It was a fever dream, It was a mass exodus born of desperation and delusion, a conscious and often catastrophic decision to abandon one reality for a glittering fantasy. To understand why our man would leap into this abyss, you first have to understand the gray, suffocating world he was so desperate to leave behind. Imagine you are a farmer in New Hampshire in 1848. Your world is a 50-acre kingdom of rocks, stumps, and disappointment. Your hands are permanent claws, the calluses so thick you could strike a match on your palm. Your primary relationship is with a stubborn mule that holds you in deep contempt, and your days are governed by the tyrannical whims of the sky. A late frost can kill your seedlings. A summer drought can wither your corn to dust. An early snow can rot the harvest in the field. Every single day, from before the sun rises until your back screams in protest, you are at war with the earth itself. And most of the time, the earth is winning. You're not building a legacy. You're just trying to keep the bank from foreclosing on the land your father also nearly lost. Your future looks exactly like your present. An endless cycle of backbreaking labor for a yield that is just barely enough to get you to the next unforgiving season. Your dreams aren't of riches. They're of a year without blight. Or perhaps you're not a farmer. Perhaps you're a clerk in a Boston counting house. You spend 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, perched on a hard wooden stool, your world reduced to the 4-foot space of your desk. The air is thick with the scent of stale ink, coal dust, and quiet desperation. Your job is to scratch numbers into a ledger with a steel-nibbed pen, an endless, monotonous river of credits and debits that flows through your fingers, but never ever touches your own life. Your boss is a man whose jowls quiver with disapproval, and your colleagues are pale, stooped men who have been sitting on the same stools for 20 years, their spines slowly curving into question marks. You're not creating anything. You're not building anything. You are a human cog in a machine you'll never understand, let alone own. You go home to a cramped room in a boarding house that smells of boiled cabbage, and you lie awake at night listening to the man in the next room cough himself to death. Your grand ambition isn't to be a captain of industry. It's to one day afford a slightly larger room, perhaps with a window that doesn't exclusively look out onto a brick wall. This was the backdrop, a world of limited options, of rigid social strata, of quiet, grinding resignation. And it is into this gray, monochrome world that the news from California arrives. It didn't arrive like a polite announcement. It arrived like a contagion, the gold fever. It started as a whisper in a tavern, a rumor from a sailor just back from the Pacific. Then a small article buried in the back of a newspaper, dismissed by most as a tall tale. But the whispers grew louder. Letters began to arrive from the west, read aloud in town squares to slack-jawed crowds. They spoke of men picking up nuggets the size of their thumbs, of rivers with beds literally paved with gold. They were breathless, ecstatic, and almost entirely fabricated or wildly exaggerated, but no one cared. The story was just too good to question. The tipping point, the moment the fever became a full-blown pandemic, came on December 5th, 1848. President James K. Polk, in his farewell address to Congress, confirmed it all. He spoke of accounts of the abundance of gold that were of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief, were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service. That was it. The official seal of the United States government had just been stamped onto the fantasy. It was no longer a rumor. It was a federally endorsed reality. Suddenly the world was alive with possibility, and with this possibility came a new kind of mentor figure, the huckster. These were the men who fanned the flames of the fever for profit. They were everywhere. They stood on soapboxes in city parks, their faces flushed with theatrical passion, painting visions of California as a new Eden where the poor man could become a prince overnight. They sold guidebooks. The Emigrant's Guide to the Gold Mines, often written by men who had never been west of the Mississippi, filled with ludicrous advice and wildly inaccurate maps that seemed to treat the Rocky Mountains as a minor inconvenience. They opened storefronts selling essential, can't-live-without-'em prospecting equipment to men who wouldn't know gold from pyrite. There were patent gold-finding machines, bizarre metal contraptions with cranks and sieves that promised to separate gold from dirt with scientific precision, but which were usually just welded junk destined to be abandoned on the prairie. There were aquascopes for seeing gold through water, special magnetic hammers, and even diving bells for walking along riverbeds. The real genius was in the accessories. Special belts with dozens of little leather pouches for all the gold you'd be carrying. Hardtack biscuits baked to the density of granite, guaranteed to last the journey. And of course, Bowie knives. Every man needed a fearsome Bowie knife, not for any practical purpose, but because it completed the costume of the rugged adventurer they all believed they were about to become. And so, our farmer or our clerk makes his decision. It happens in stages. First, the secret daydreaming, imagining the feel of a heavy gold nugget in his hand. Then, the conversations. He talks to his friends, who are having the exact same daydreams. They form a mining company, a brotherhood of hope. They gather in a tavern, draft formal articles of agreement full of high-minded clauses about loyalty and the equal sharing of all profits, a document that would become hilariously irrelevant the moment the first man found a flake of gold bigger than his fingernail. Then comes the hardest conversation, telling the family. He sits at the dinner table and explains to his wife that he's going to leave her and the children for a year, maybe 2. He's going to risk his life, and their entire life savings, the $10 from the sale of the stubborn mule, the $50 from mortgaging the farm, on a 2,000-mile journey to a place he can't find on a map. But he paints the picture for her, the same picture the hucksters painted for him. He won't be a farmer anymore. He'll be a landowner. They won't just be surviving. They'll be thriving. He'll come back a rich man, a man of status. And in this moment, there is something genuinely, tragically awe-inspiring. It's the sheer, unadulterated power of hope. For this one brief period, before the journey begins, everything is possible. The departure from home is often a celebration. The whole town turns out to see their boys off, the newly formed Schenectady Mining and Trading Association, marching down Main Street, utterly clueless but filled with a radiant communal optimism. They are no longer clerks and farmers. They are Argonauts, adventurers on a heroic quest. They are convinced they are marching toward their destiny. In reality, they are marching toward a shallow grave. But for now, in the golden light of that hopeful morning, they couldn't possibly know it. They had answered the call. Holidays? Paid leave? Weekends? Such adorable civilized concepts were about as common in the gold fields of 1849 as a hot bath and a balanced diet. The god of the 49er was Mammon, and Mammon did not believe in taking Sundays off. The daily grind wasn't just a part of the life, it was the entire life. It was a relentless, Sisyphean cycle of grueling labor that began before the sun had the courage to show its face and only ended when the darkness made it physically impossible to punish your body any further. Our man, let's call him Silas, having survived the treacherous journey and arrived in the Sacramento Valley, would have experienced his first great disappointment before he even touched a shovel. The dream, whispered in taverns back east, was of a pristine wilderness, a tranquil river valley where a man could find a quiet spot and peacefully pan for his fortune. The reality was a chaotic, sprawling, open-air lunatic asylum. Instead of serene nature, he found Sacramento City, a squalid canvas and timber metropolis that had erupted from the mud almost overnight. He found tens of thousands of other men, all with the same desperate, hungry look in their eyes, all scrambling over each other for a piece of the action, the air, which should have smelled of pine and clean mountain air, stank of frying bacon, cheap whiskey, and a general lack of sanitation that would make a vulture retch. After being swindled into buying a new pickaxe for 10 times its worth and a claim map that was likely drawn by the seller that morning, Silas would head for the diggings. Staking a claim was his first taste of the new social order. There were no deeds, no surveyors, no lawyers. A claim was typically 10 square feet of riverbank, a plot of land roughly the size of a generous grave, marked by a few hastily piled rocks and a notice scrawled on a piece of wood. The only thing that enforced your ownership was the implicit threat of violence. You were surrounded on all sides by other men, their claims bordering yours so closely you could hear them muttering curses under their breath. The only privacy was the kind you find in a packed stockyard. This was his kingdom. 10 feet of mud and gravel. A day in this kingdom began in the frigid, damp darkness of 4 a.m. Sleep was a shallow, troubled affair on the hard ground, often interrupted by the coughing fits of a neighbor or the frantic scratching at lice. You'd awaken not rested, but simply less exhausted than you were when you collapsed. The first sensation was the cold. Not just a chill in the air, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, seeping into your bones through your thin, perpetually damp woolen blanket. You'd stumble out of your makeshift tent or hovel, your joints already creaking in protest, and begin the morning ritual. Breakfast, if you were lucky, was a chunk of hardtack biscuit, so dense it was often called a sheet iron cracker, soaked in black, bitter coffee to a consistency that wouldn't shatter your teeth. Maybe a slice of greasy salt pork, if the supply lines hadn't been washed out. This wasn't a meal. It was fuel, shoveled into the furnace to prepare for the day's burn. Then, it was off to the river. The work itself came in several distinct flavors of agony, each a special kind of physical torture. For the newcomer, it began with the pan. You'd take your shallow metal pan, shovel in a few pounds of dirt and gravel from the riverbank, and wade into the water. And oh, that water. It wasn't a gentle, babbling brook. It was melted snow, fresh from the peaks of the Sierra Nevada. It was shockingly, breathtakingly, numbingly cold. You'd stand there, bent at the waist in a posture that would make a modern chiropractor weep, with this glacial water swirling around your knees and hands. For hours, you'd perform the motion. Dip, swirl, tilt, shake. Dip, swirl, tilt, shake. Letting the lighter sand and gravel wash over the lip while hoping the heavier gold, the color, would stay at the bottom. Your lower back would begin to scream. Your knees would ache. Your fingers, submerged in the icy water, would go numb, turning into clumsy, useless sausages. After 10 minutes, it was excruciating. After 4 hours, it was a state of being. And the reward for this? Pan after pan might reveal nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just a collection of pretty pebbles and, the ultimate insult, glittering flecks of iron pyrite. Fool's gold, winking at you, mocking your hope. But then, it would happen. Maybe 1 pan in 100. After you've washed away the last of the black sand, you'd see it. A tiny, gleaming flake of yellow, a speck smaller than a grain of rice. And in that moment, a jolt would run through your entire body. It was a shot of pure, uncut adrenaline. The cold, the pain, the exhaustion, it all vanished. This single microscopic flake was proof. It was real. The stories were true. It was a moment of such profound validation that it could fuel another week of misery. It was the positive in your profit-loss ledger of suffering, the tiny crumb of hope that kept the whole desperate enterprise from collapsing. Once you'd saved enough dust from panning, or more likely, partnered with the men on the claims next to you, men you'd been silently hating for a week, you might graduate to a rocker, also called a cradle. This was a 2-man instrument of torture, It was a wooden box on rockers with a sieve on top and riffles, small bars, on its sloping bottom. One man, the shoveler, would spend all day digging up gravel and clay from the claim, a task that involved breaking his back with a pick and shovel and hauling it bucket by heavy bucket to the rocker. The other man would pour water over the top while furiously rocking the cradle back and forth with a handle. The noise was a maddening rhythmic creak squawk that would echo in your ears long after you stopped. It was mindless, repetitive, physical labor of the highest order. At the end of the day, you'd clean out the riffles, hoping to find a teaspoon of gold dust. This was progress. You were now moving a literal ton of earth a day for maybe a few dollars worth of gold, to be split between you and your equally miserable partner. The environment itself was your constant, active antagonist. The sun, in the California summer, was not a friendly warmth. It was a celestial blacksmith's forge. It beat down on you relentlessly, cracking your lips, baking the back of your neck raw, and reflecting off the water with a blinding glare that would leave you seeing spots. Heat stroke was a constant companion, felling men in the middle of the day, and with the heat came the flies, the mosquitoes, the no-see-ums, a biblical plague of biting, buzzing tormentors that feasted on your sweat-caked skin. The landscape was a minefield of its own. Poison oak, with its oily, blister-raising leaves, grew everywhere, and for men from the east who had no idea what it was a source of endless, agonizing rashes. Rattlesnakes, disturbed by all the digging, were a constant threat under rocks and in crevices. The very ground you worked was an unholy union of sharp rocks that gashed your hands and thick, sucking mud that tried to steal your boots with every step. And the sensory overload was a symphony of suffering, a masterpiece of misery. The dominant sound was not the whisper of the wind through the pines, but a grating, industrial cacophony. The relentless scrape thump of thousands of shovels hitting rock, the metallic shale of gravel in pans, the squeaking groans of hundreds of wooden rockers, the distant crack of a mule skinner's whip, the occasional angry shout of a claim dispute, and the punctuation of a casual gunshot. The dominant smell, the true Eau de 49, was a complex bouquet. It started with a base note of wet, rotting earth and the vegetal scent of disturbed river muck. Layered on top was the pungent aroma of thousands of unwashed, sweating men. Add to that the sharp, acrid stench of the makeshift latrines, the smoke from 1,000 campfires burning green wood, the smell of rancid bacon grease, and the faint coppery undertone of sickness and blood. You didn't just live in it, you wore it. It clung to your clothes, your hair, your very skin. The day ended when the light failed. There was no quitting time. You worked until you literally couldn't see what you were doing. Then you'd stumble back to your hovel, your muscles screaming, your hands raw and bleeding. Dinner was a repeat of breakfast. You'd force it down, then collapse onto your blanket, not to sleep, but to enter a state of semi-conscious exhaustion, your mind still hearing the creak squawk of the rocker as you drifted off, knowing that in just a few short hours, the whole agonizing, mud-caked, soul-crushing carnival would begin all over again. The great California gold rush was built on a holy trinity of simple tools: the pick, the shovel, and the pan. These were the implements of salvation, the instruments that would unlock the earth's treasure. At least that was the sales pitch. The reality was that these tools, along with their more complicated cousins, were often just overpriced, poorly made implements of torture that conspired against our man Silas with what felt like a malicious, sentient intelligence. They weren't just tools, they were his daily betrayers. Let's start with the most iconic of them all, the gold pan. This was the symbol of the 49er, the shallow basin of hope. In the illustrated guides sold back east, it looked simple enough: a lightweight, elegant disc for gracefully separating wealth from dirt. The pan Silas actually bought in Sacramento for the low price of $8, roughly a month's wages back home, was a heavy, clumsy thing stamped from sheet iron. Its first betrayal was its weight. Holding it outstretched for hours, filled with wet gravel, was an exercise in pure masochism. Its second betrayal was its inefficiency. To extract a few dollars worth of gold, you had to wash hundreds upon hundreds of pans of gravel. It was the geological equivalent of trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. But its greatest treachery was its skill requirement. Using a pan correctly was a delicate art, a subtle dance of water and gravity. It required a specific, gentle, swirling motion to let the lighter material wash away while keeping the dense gold flakes settled in the crease. A lifetime of farming or clerking did not prepare one for this. For the first few weeks, Silas would have been a master of accidental disposal. He'd swirl too aggressively and watch a potential day's wages cascade back into the river. He'd tilt too little and be left with a pan full of useless mud. The pan became a cruel teacher, and its lesson was simple. You are not worthy. It would taunt him, occasionally offering up a single glittering flake, just enough to keep him from hammering it into a misshapen plate and hurling it at the nearest squirrel. If the pan was the symbol, the pick and shovel were the engines of his misery. These were not the finely balanced, ergonomic tools of the modern age. These were crude, brutal things. A typical prospector's pick, purchased from a smiling charlatan on the docks of San Francisco, might have a head of questionable cast iron attached to a handle made of green, unseasoned hickory. For the first few hours of jarring impact against the rocky California soil, it held up. But green wood has a tendency to crack under stress. The handle would develop splinters that would embed themselves in Silas's calloused palms, later to fester into infections. Then, inevitably, at the apex of a powerful swing meant to break apart a promising chunk of quartz, the handle would snap. The jarring shock would rattle up his arms into his teeth, followed by the terrifying sight of the heavy iron pickhead cartwheeling through the air, narrowly missing his partner's skull. The shovel was no better. It was his primary means of moving the earth, and he would move tons of it. The cheap iron blades, meant for the soft loam of an eastern farm, would bend and buckle against the cement-like hardpan of a dry riverbed. The rivets holding the handle to the blade would work themselves loose, making every shovelful a wobbly, inefficient joke. He spent more time trying to fix his shovel than he did using it, reseating the handle, tightening the collar, and cursing the man who sold it to him, a man who was by now probably relaxing in a fine hotel, paid for by the desperation of fools like Silas. When a man graduated from the pan, he moved on to the rocker or cradle. This was supposed to be a leap forward in technology, a machine for mass-producing disappointment. Most were not prefabricated, but built on site, a group project in flawed carpentry. They were nailed together from whatever rough-sawn pine could be had, often warping and cracking within days of exposure to the constant cycle of wet and dry. The joints, held by expensive nails, would work loose from the ceaseless, violent rocking. The screen on top, meant to filter out large rocks, would invariably have holes big enough to let small nuggets fall through, lost forever. The riffle bars on the bottom, meant to catch the gold, were often set at the wrong angle, creating a perfect gentle slide for the fine gold dust to wash right out with the waste tailings. The entire contraption was a testament to misplaced optimism, a leaky, groaning, inefficient machine that required 3 men to do the work of one. Very tired man. The sound it produced, a rhythmic and agonizing squeak, groan, thump, became the official soundtrack of the diggings, a chorus of shared suffering. As for personal protective equipment, this is where the dark humor truly flourishes. Silas's state-of-the-art safety gear consisted primarily of a single set of clothes he wore every single day. His shirt, a heavy wool or flannel number, was a marvel of poor design. In the summer, it was in suffocating, sweat-soaked blanket. When it got wet from river spray or a sudden downpour, which was always, it became a heavy, sodden weight that took literally days to dry, clinging to his skin and chilling him to the bone even on a warm day. His trousers were thick canvas, which, when soaked in the icy river water, would chafe his legs raw, creating weeping sores that never had a chance to heal. But the crown jewel of his inadequate protection was his boots. A good pair of boots was the single most critical piece of equipment a prospector could own, and they were universally, catastrophically terrible. For a fortune, $20 or $30, he would buy a pair of knee-high leather boots that promised to be impervious to water. This was a lie. After a day or two of being submerged in the river and then baked in the sun, the wax and tallow-sealed seams would crack. The leather itself would grow stiff and brittle. Soon, a small leak would begin, a trickle of that glacial water that would soak his sock. Within a week, the boot was no longer a piece of footwear. It was a personal bucket. He would work for 12 hours with his feet submerged in a freezing, muddy slurry inside his own boots. This led to a host of foot ailments, from blisters and fungal infections to the dreaded immersion foot, where the skin would turn pale, swell, and begin to die. A failed pair of boots could cripple a man, rendering him unable to work. And in the economy of the gold fields, a man who couldn't work didn't eat. And so, this unholy matrimony with his tools defined his existence. He depended on them completely, yet he resented them with every fiber of his being. They were not trusted companions. They were sullen, unreliable employees. Every evening, by the flickering light of a campfire, was spent in grudging maintenance. He'd sit on a log, trying to sharpen the blunted edge of his shovel with a flat rock. He'd wrap the splintering handle of his pick with strips of hide, hoping to get another day's use out of it. He'd try to patch the gaping hole in his boots with a piece of canvas and pine pitch, a temporary and futile gesture against the inevitable. He cursed them. He mended them. He relied on them. This relationship, forged in shared misery and mutual disrespect, was the perfect microcosm of the gold rush itself. An enterprise built on a foundation of broken promises and faulty equipment. If you could have put the average 49er on a pedestal and observed him like a piece of sculpture after 6 months in the diggings, you wouldn't have seen the heroic figure from the recruitment posters. You would have seen a masterpiece of accelerated decay, a living museum of occupational hazards. The gold rush didn't just ask for a man's labor. It demanded the methodical dismantling of his body and the slow, grinding erosion of his sanity. The physical and mental toll was not a risk of the job. It was the job. Let's begin with the scaffolding of the man himself, his skeleton. By the time he reached what a pampered Bostonian might consider his prime, say, the ripe old age of 30, our man Silas's body was already a catalog of anatomical complaints. His spine, once straight and strong from a life of pitching hay, likely now resembled a gnarled river willow, permanently bent into the miner's stoop from endless hours crouched over a pan or rocker. This wasn't just poor posture. It was a structural deformation, a daily agony of compressed discs and screaming lumbar nerves. His joints, particularly his knees and hips, would sing a constant aria of agony, a symphony of grinding cartilage and inflammation we now call arthritis. For Silas, it was just the rheumatiz, a constant, unwelcome companion that made the simple act of standing up in the morning a 10-minute ordeal of groans and curses. And then there were the hernias. The act of prying a huge rock from the riverbed with a shovel as a lever was a perfect recipe for blowing out your abdominal wall. A catastrophic injury that essentially ended your working life on the spot. His hands and feet were the frontline casualties, the points of direct contact with the misery. His hands, oh, his magnificent ruined hands. They were less flesh and blood, and more a kind of organic, ruined leather, The palms were paved with a solid callus, which would ironically offer little protection when it inevitably dried and cracked open in the sun, creating deep, bleeding fissures. Every cut, scrape, and splinter, and there were dozens a day, was an open invitation for infection from the bacteriologically adventurous soup of the river water. His fingernails were perpetually blackened, split, and often missing entirely. His feet were even worse, marinating for 12 hours a day in their personal swamps of icy, filthy water inside his leaky boots. They were a textbook case of immersion foot. The skin would be pale, wrinkled, and spongy, often sloughing off in patches. Blisters would form, pop, and become open, weeping sores. Fungal infections would thrive between his toes, creating a maddening, incurable itch. The simple act of walking back to his tent at the end of the day was a white-hot agony. The man's face, his very identity, was being remade by the environment. The relentless glare of the sun off the water and rock burned his skin, leaving it a cracked, leathery mask, while simultaneously searing his eyes. Many miners suffered from a constant, painful inflammation, their eyes perpetually bloodshot and weeping from the dust, grit, and unfiltered ultraviolet rays. After a year, a fresh-faced 20-year-old from Ohio would look like a 45-year-old deckhand who had spent his life rounding Cape Horn. He was being aged not in years, but in back-breaking, sun-scorched, frost-bitten days. But it wasn't just the spectacular, visible injuries that wore a man down. Oh no. The true genius of the goldfields was in its portfolio of fascinating internal afflictions. The single greatest killer, the undisputed king of miner misery, was dysentery. Miners called it the bloody flux, a term both accurate and horrifyingly understated. The cause was tragically simple. The very river they were working in was also their toilet and their source of drinking water. Thousands of men were crammed along the banks of the American and Feather rivers, and their untreated sewage went directly into the stream their downstream colleagues were drinking from. The result was a permanent, camp-wide epidemic of amoebic and bacterial dysentery. It was a debilitating, dehydrating, and utterly humiliating way to go, reducing a strong man to a weak, feverish wreck who couldn't stray more than 10 feet from a shovel-dug latrine trench. Its cousin, cholera, was even more terrifying. A man could be fine at breakfast and dead by dinner, literally desiccated from the inside out by violent, uncontrollable fluid loss. If the flux didn't get you, scurvy might. The 49er diet was a culinary tour of despair, consisting almost exclusively of bacon, salt, beans, starch, and biscuits, more starch. This monotonous, grease-heavy diet was utterly devoid of vitamin C. After a few months, the symptoms would begin. First, a profound lethargy. Then the gums would begin to swell, bleed, and rot, and the teeth would loosen in their sockets. Old scars and previously healed wounds would mysteriously reopen on the skin. It was as if the body was forgetting how to hold itself together, literally disintegrating from a lack of basic nutrition. Men would pay $1, a full day's earnings, for a single potato or an onion, not as a treat, but as life-saving medicine. While his body was engaged in this constant losing battle against physics and biology, his mind was fighting its own silent war in the screaming quiet of his skull. The primary enemy was the sheer soul-crushing weight of disappointment. He had gambled everything on this venture, his savings, his family's security, his health, and every single day that he didn't find the mother lode was another tick on the scoreboard of his failure. This wasn't a job, it was a lottery, and he was holding a losing ticket, but was forced to keep buying more. This bred a corrosive and pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and paranoia. Every man was a rival. The friendly fellow from the next claim over, he was probably sneaking over at night to pan your best gravel. Your own partner? You'd watch him like a hawk when cleaning out the sluice box, sure he was skimming a little extra dust for himself. Silas would sleep with his meager pouch of gold dust stitched into his underwear, his hand resting on the hilt of his Bowie knife. He'd jolt awake at the sound of a coyote, convinced it was a claim jumper about to slit his throat. There was no trust, no law, only a constant, humming, low-grade fear. Then there was the monotony. The same back-breaking work, day after day. The same miserable food, the same view of the same muddy patch of riverbank. It was profoundly dehumanizing. It stripped away identity, ambition, and hope, replacing them with a dull, animalistic instinct for survival. A man ceased to be Silas, the farmer from New Hampshire with a wife and 2 children. He became a shoveling machine, a rocking machine, a machine for enduring misery. This was punctuated by flashes of profound, gut-wrenching homesickness. A particular slant of evening light, the smell of wood smoke, could trigger a vivid memory of home, of a warm kitchen or a child's laughter. That was so painful it would make him physically double over. How did they cope? Mostly they drank. As soon as a camp was established, the first profitable business was always the saloon, usually just a plank of wood laid over 2 barrels. Here a man could buy a tin cup full of cheap, potent, and often adulterated whiskey for a pinch of gold dust. For a few hours, the alcohol could numb the cold in his bones, the ache in his back, and the gaping hole of his disappointment. This self-medication, of course, led to its own catalog of disasters. Drunken brawls that ended in stabbings, accidental drownings, and men gambling away a month's hard-won dust in a single night of faro or monte, fleeced by professional gamblers who understood the easiest thing to mine in California was the miners themselves. It was a closed, vicious cycle. The misery drove the drinking, and the drinking amplified the misery. The body was breaking, the mind was fracturing, and the dream of gold was becoming a waking nightmare. Travel rarely happens in a vacuum, and if Silas thought the soul-crushing labor, the hostile environment, and the constant threat of disease were the sum of his problems, he was in for a rude awakening. He had forgotten the most ingenious and prolific source of misery known to man: other men. The gold fields were a grand, chaotic experiment in what happens when you strip away society, law, and decency, and replace it with a singular primal motivator: greed. The result was a social landscape every bit as treacherous and unforgiving as the physical one. His direct superior wasn't an overseer with a whip. In some ways, it was worse. His new boss was the camp merchant, the man who ran the store. The store was usually a large tent or a crude plank shack, and its proprietor was a man who had shrewdly realized that the only certain way to get rich in a gold rush was to not dig for gold. This man, let's call him Jedediah, had arrived early, staked a claim on commerce, and now ruled his muddy kingdom like a pot-bellied tyrant. Jedediah's qualifications were a complete lack of sentimentality and an ironclad understanding of supply and demand. He was the one who would sell you a rusty shovel for $10, a pound of flour for $2, and a single precious egg for $1 in dust. He held the power of life and death. When your boots failed, he was the one who had a new, equally terrible pair for an ounce of gold. When scurvy began to loosen your teeth, he was the one selling jars of pickled limes at a price that would make a king blanch. And the best part? He was the one weighing your hard-won gold dust on his own tarnished brass scales, his thumb often resting ever so gently on the beam, his expression a perfect mask of bored indifference. He didn't need to appreciate your labor. Gratitude was a foreign currency. Your reward for a week of back-breaking toil was the privilege of giving most of your earnings to Jedediah, just so you could do it all over again. Then there were your fellow sufferers, the unmerry band of brothers in misery. The myth, the one sold back east, was of a grand fraternity of adventurers, a brotherhood of Argonauts united in a noble quest. And in the very beginning, there were fleeting moments that felt like it. There was a grim sort of camaraderie that flickered to life around a shared campfire at night. The brief fellowship of men who understood the particular ache in your back without you having to say a word. Laughter, when it occurred, was a harsh, barking sound, usually at the expense of some poor soul who had fallen in the river or been tricked into digging for a week on a salted claim. Partnerships were formed out of pure necessity. You couldn't operate a rocker or a long tom alone. This forced interdependence could sometimes feel like solidarity, a small island of us against the vast, indifferent wilderness. You shared your labor, your food, and your dark gallows humor. But this camaraderie was a thin, fragile veneer stretched taut over a deep well of suspicion and paranoia. Constant privation and disappointment had a way of turning men inward, or against each other. The man you partnered with yesterday was still the man who could steal your dust tomorrow. Every other prospector was your direct competitor, a rival for the same finite resource. This bred a culture of intense secrecy. If you found a promising patch of ground, you didn't celebrate. You worked it quietly, your eyes constantly scanning the hillsides, hoping no one noticed. A friendly question like, "How's the color today?" was seen for what it was, an act of espionage. The correct answer was always a non-committal grunt and a scowl. The mining partnership itself was an institution ripe for conflict. It was a marriage of convenience, with no love, little trust, and a prenuptial agreement that was usually worthless. Arguments were constant and bitter. One partner would inevitably accuse the other of being lazy, of not pulling his weight on the rocker handle. Disputes would erupt over how to divide the day's pathetic earnings. One man wants to spend it on more beans and bacon to fuel the work. The other wants to take it straight to the saloon tent to drown his sorrows. The ultimate fear, one that kept many a man awake at night, was that you'd wake up one morning to find your partner, your share of the gold, and the best shovel all gone, vanished into the wilderness. In this lawless world, a crude system of justice emerged known as the Miners' Code. When a crime was committed, a miners' meeting would be called. This was democracy at its most raw and terrifying. The accused would be brought before an impromptu court of his fellow miners, who acted as judge, jury, and, if necessary, executioner. There were no lawyers, no appeals. Justice was swift, brutal, and heavily prejudiced. The punishment for stealing a mule or a pouch of dust was typically a dozen lashes with a whip, having one's ear cropped, or being banished from the diggings, which was often a death sentence. For murder or a particularly egregious case of claim jumping, the sentence was hanging from the nearest sturdy oak tree. This rough justice became a tool for enforcing the darkest part of the human element: racism. The gold fields were a magnet for people from all over the world, and the predominantly white American miners did not see this as a vibrant melting pot. They saw it as an infestation of rivals. The most experienced and skilled miners were often from Mexico and Chile. They knew how to read the terrain and extract gold efficiently, and their success bred a venomous resentment. White miners would band together, call a miners' meeting, and vote to expel all foreigners from a particular gulch, declaring that the gold of California was reserved for true Americans. These resolutions were enforced with threats, beatings, and the burning of camps. The Chinese miners, who began arriving in 1849 and 1850, faced even more organized persecution. They were seen as strange and clannish, and were subjected to violent assaults and systemic discrimination. A foreign miners' tax was instituted, targeting primarily Chinese and Latino miners, and demanding a ruinous monthly fee for the right to work. They were often relegated to working the tailings, the piles of waste gravel already processed and discarded by white miners, forced to painstakingly search for the tiny flakes the original miners had missed. And the original inhabitants of the land, the various Native American tribes of the Sierra foothills, suffered most of all. Their ancestral lands were invaded, their villages disrupted, their hunting grounds destroyed, and the rivers they depended on were turned into polluted sludge. They were seen by the miners as either dangerous pests to be exterminated or as a potential source of slave labor. The human element of the gold rush wasn't just about suspicion and rivalry. It was about a wave of humanity that actively and violently displaced or destroyed anyone who stood in its way. It was a brutal, ugly, and foundational part of the experience. To suggest that the life of a 49er contained anything approaching luxury is an insult to the very concept. Comfort, in the gold fields, was not a goal to be achieved. It was a distant, hazy memory of a former life, a ghost that occasionally visited to mock you in your sleep. The daily necessities of food, shelter, and rest were not sources of rejuvenation, but were themselves just another set of trials to be endured, another series of hurdles in the steeplechase of suffering. Let's embark on a grand tour of the finer things in a prospector's life. First, the culinary scene. Dining in Camp Desperation was a gastronomic experience best forgotten, a monotonous cycle of grease and grit. The miner's diet was famously known as the 3 B's: bacon, beans, and biscuits. This wasn't a choice. It was the entire menu, dictated by what wouldn't immediately rot on the multi-month journey around the Horn or across the plains, and what the camp merchant, Jedediah, decided to stock. Let's break down the tasting menu. The star of the show was the bacon, or more accurately, salt pork. This was the primary source of 2 vital things: flavor, in the form of overwhelming saltiness, and fat. It arrived in giant barrels, having been cured with enough salt to mummify a pharaoh. It was often a streaky, discolored gray, and upon opening a barrel, one might be greeted with a powerful aroma of rancidity and, depending on the quality, a lively, welcoming committee of maggots, which were usually just scraped off with a knife. Silas would slice off a chunk and fry it in his pan over an open fire. It would sputter and shrink, releasing a torrent of grease that was carefully saved. This liquid gold was the universal cooking medium for everything else. The pork itself was leathery, chewy, and so salty it made your tongue curl, but it was hot, and it was calories. Next up, the beans. A bland and uninspiring legume, but it was cheap, and it filled a hole in your stomach. The problem was that in the high altitude, and with the limited firewood, they took an eternity to cook to a state of being merely al dente. More often than not, they were eaten half raw, leading to a level of digestive distress that in a camp already ravaged by dysentery felt like a cruel joke. The foundation of the pyramid was the bread product. Sometimes this was hardtack, the sheet iron cracker we've already met, a biscuit baked to the density of ceramic tile, which had to be soaked in coffee for 10 minutes before it could be chewed. More often it was a flapjack or a biscuit made from flour. The flour, however, was a luxury item and often of dubious quality. It was frequently infested with weevils. The common practice was to simply mix the weevils into the batter, with the grim joke being that it was extra protein. Silas would mix this flour with water, maybe a pinch of saleratus for leavening, and then fry the resulting dough in the saved bacon grease. The result was a heavy, greasy pancake that sat in the stomach like a stone, providing the raw fuel for another 12 hours of hauling rocks. To wash this all down, you had 2 choices. By day it was coffee. The beans were purchased green, then roasted, or more accurately burned, in a frying pan over the campfire until they were black and smoking. The resulting charcoal was then crushed with a rock, boiled in a pot of river water, and drunk, grounds and all. It was black, bitter, gritty, and probably 90% of the reason anyone got out of their tent in the morning. By night, the beverage of choice was whiskey. This wasn't a fine, aged bourbon. This was Tanglefoot, or 40 Rod, a raw, brutal spirit, often distilled poorly and sold by the saloon tent at an exorbitant price. To make it seem more potent, unscrupulous vendors would often adulterate it with anything from tobacco juice to chili powder, to even a hint of strychnine, just to give it that extra kick. It wasn't for savoring. It was for obliterating the day's misery as quickly as possible. As for your living quarters, the term shelter is a generous one. For most of his first year, Silas's home was a small tent, perhaps 6 feet by 8, made of a thin canvas that offered the illusion of privacy, but little else. It was not waterproof. A steady rain would first create a fine, penetrating mist inside, before giving way to steady drips that would inevitably find their way directly over your sleeping face. It was not insulated. On a cold night, the temperature inside the tent was functionally identical to the temperature outside. The floor of this fine home was the bare, muddy earth. His furniture was curated from the surrounding landscape. His bed was a pile of pine boughs, which offered a fragrant, springy cushion for about 2 nights before the needles fell off, leaving him with a lumpy pile of sticks. This bedding also quickly became a thriving metropolis for fleas, lice, spiders, and other creatures delighted to find a warm human body to feast upon at night. His chair was a log. His table was a rock. His closet was a nail hammered into the tent pole. He lived with a level of grime and discomfort that was absolute. There was no escape from the dirt. It was in his food, his water, his bedding, his clothes, and under his fingernails. It was a permanent feature of his existence. And privacy? A concept as alien as a day off. Tents were crammed together, inches apart. He could hear his neighbor to the left snoring, his neighbor to the right having a coughing fit, and the 2 men across the way having a drunken argument. The entire camp was a single, sprawling organism of shared squalor. With such luxurious accommodations, you can imagine that a night's rest was anything but. The very notion that night was for uninterrupted sleep was a charming fairy tale. If the gnawing cold seeping up from the ground didn't keep you awake, plenty of other diversions would. There was the constant, maddening itch of louse bites on your scalp and fleas in your blanket. There was the sharp pain in your back as the flattest rock on your claim, which you had somehow missed, decided to make its presence known. The day's aches and pains, ignored during the heat of labor, would return with a vengeance in the quiet of the night, throbbing and pulsing in time with your heartbeat. Then came the sounds. The camp was never silent. The raucous, off-key singing and occasional gunshot from the saloon tent might continue until dawn. A pack of coyotes would start yipping and howling on a nearby ridge, their calls sounding unnervingly like mocking laughter. And then there was the paranoia. Every rustle of leaves outside your tent, every snap of a twig, was a potential claim jumper or a thief, come to steal your meager pouch of dust. Silas would lie there, motionless in the dark, hand on his knife, heart pounding, listening for minutes on end, only to realize it was just a raccoon. Deep restorative slumber was a rare and precious commodity, doled out in miserly, broken increments. The cumulative effect of this chronic sleep deprivation was devastating. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a slow unraveling of the mind, making a man clumsy, irritable, and prone to the kind of poor decisions that could get him killed. The 49er wasn't just sleep deprived. He was being systematically deprived of the one thing that might have allowed him to recover from his own life. The concept of a regular payday, involving a predetermined salary, was, for our man Silas, a quaint memory of a past life. He was no longer a wage earner. He was an entrepreneur. He was the sole proprietor of Silas Mining, Inc., a bold venture built on a foundation of boundless optimism and catastrophic ignorance. The problem was, this new career was less a business and more a rigged casino, where the house not only had all the odds in its favor, but also sold you the air you breathed and the dirt you stood on. The economic reality of the gold rush was a masterclass in financial futility, a perfect engine for turning hope into debt. The lure, the central promise that pulled 100,000 men across a continent, was the rumor of an ounce a day. An ounce of gold in 1849 was worth about $16. To a farmer who might see $50 in cash in a good year, $16 a day wasn't just a fortune. It was a figure of pure fantasy. It was the promise of becoming a king in a matter of months. This was the projected gross revenue of Silas Mining Inc., and it was a spectacular lie. While a handful of incredibly lucky early arrivals did experience such bonanzas, by the time the main wave of 49ers arrived, the easy pickings were long gone. The reality was far grimmer. On a good day of backbreaking 12-hour labor, a team of 2 or 3 men working a rocker might clear half an ounce between them. This worked out to perhaps $3 to $5 per man. On an average day, it was closer to $1 or $2. On many, many days, the grand total was 0, a complete bust. The daily payout was a pathetic little pile of gold dust and flakes in the bottom of a pan, a tangible and deeply insulting measure of your failure. But this paltry income is only half of the story. To truly appreciate the economic genius of the goldfields, you have to look at the expense report from hell. Everything necessary for survival had to be shipped from the East Coast around South America or hauled over the plains, and the merchants who controlled these goods knew they had a captive market. The prices they charged were not just high, they were a form of methodical extortion. Let's follow Silas on a shopping trip to Jedediah's glorious emporium. He needs to restock. A pound of flour, often crawling with weevils? That'll be $2. A pound of salt pork, glistening with rancid fat? Another $1.50. A pound of coffee beans? $1. A pound of sugar to make the coffee drinkable? $2. A single solitary onion to ward off the scurvy currently making his gums bleed? $1. His daily food cost, for the most miserable, monotonous diet imaginable, could easily eclipse his entire daily earnings. He was often literally working at a loss, his body's reserves and the initial stake he brought from home being the only things keeping him from starvation. Then there were the capital expenditures. That pickaxe handle that snapped? A new one costs $5. The shovel blade that bent on a stubborn rock? A new shovel is $10. And his boots, those magnificent waterlogged instruments of torture, have finally disintegrated. A new pair of waterproof boots, which everyone knew was a lie, would cost him an ounce of gold. $16. He might have to work for a full week, a week of agonizing bootless labor in the freezing river, just to afford the privilege of putting his feet into a new pair of leaky prisons. The currency itself was a tool of the house. Transactions were conducted in dust. When Silas wanted to buy his supplies, he'd pull out his small leather pouch. Jedediah, the merchant, would get out his scales. He'd instruct Silas to pour out the required amount, and then he'd perform the pinch. For small purchases, a merchant was often entitled to what he could pick up between his thumb and forefinger as a measurement. Unsurprisingly, merchants tended to have broad, fleshy thumbs. For larger amounts, the scales were used, but they were notoriously unreliable. A little grease on the pivot, a slightly heavier weight, or just the residual dust from 100 previous transactions could tip the balance in the house's favor. The entire economy was designed to systematically transfer the wealth from the men who dug it up to the men who sold them the means to survive another day. Herein lies the grand cosmic irony of the California gold rush. Silas and the 100,000 men like him were the lifeblood of a world-changing economic event. In the first 5 years, they extracted over $2 billion worth of gold in today's money. This immense river of wealth fueled the astonishing growth of San Francisco, turning it from a sleepy village into a major city overnight. It paid for the state of California to enter the Union. It helped fund the Union Army in the Civil War a decade later, fundamentally altering the course of American history. Our man Silas was the engine of all this. His sweat, his aching back, his bleeding hands, his ruined health. This was the fuel that powered a nation's expansion. And what was his reward for this pivotal role in history? He was rewarded with a social status somewhere between a stray dog and a patch of poison oak. He moved mountains of wealth, yet his own pockets contained nothing but lint, and his stomach, a constant, gnawing emptiness. He was the human cog in a great machine, a disposable part that could be worked until it broke and then easily replaced by the next hopeful fool off the boat. The wealth didn't stick to him. It flowed right past him, into the pockets of the Jedediahs, the shipping magnates, the saloon keepers, and the bankers in their fine San Francisco offices. His already precarious existence was further buffeted by the whims of forces far beyond his control. The weather was a capricious god and a cruel economist. During the long, hot, dry season, the rivers would shrink to a trickle. This made working the riverbeds easier, but it also meant there was no water to run the rockers and sluices, the only tools for processing large amounts of gravel. He was forced back to the pan, or to dry digging, a truly desperate affair of hacking at the baked, concrete-like earth far from the river for minuscule returns. Then the rainy season would come, the heavens would open up, and the gentle streams would become raging chocolate-brown torrents. A single flash flood could obliterate a month's work in minutes, washing away a carefully constructed dam or a 50-foot sluice box as if it were a child's toy. The rain turned the camps into impassable seas of mud and brought all work to a grinding halt for weeks, leaving men to huddle in their leaky tents, watching their food supplies dwindle and their debts to Jedediah mount. The only thing worse than working was not being able to work. The concept of finishing a job was a foreign one in the goldfields. There was no final whistle, no project completion bonus, no sense of a task accomplished. There was only the work, and then more of the work. The entire enterprise of the gold rush was predicated on a single tantalizing idea: the big strike, the mother lode. This was the imagined finish line. That one glorious moment when Silas would plunge his pickaxe into a seam of pure gold or unearth a nugget the size of his head. This singular event would justify all the suffering, erase all the debt, and transform him into a king. The problem is, for 99% of the men who went, the mother lode was a myth. It was a mirage that shimmered on the horizon, always receding, its sole purpose being to keep them marching through the desert of their daily lives until they dropped. The journey wasn't a linear progression towards that goal. It was a closed loop. The days bled into one another, indistinguishable save for the minor variations in pain and disappointment. Wake in the cold dark, force down the gritty coffee and greasy bacon, stumble to the river, stand in the freezing water, wash gravel, find nothing, wash more gravel, find a few flakes, feel a flicker of hope, wash more gravel, find nothing, curse, stumble back to the tent, force down the bland beans and weevily bread, collapse into a shallow, disturbed sleep, repeat. This wasn't a life. It was a single miserable day, copied and pasted into infinity. This cycle played out on a larger scale as well, in the life of a claim. A prospector would spend days, sometimes weeks, searching for a promising spot on the river. He'd finally stake his 10-foot plot, his heart filled with that familiar, treacherous hope. Then came the brutal labor of clearing the spot, moving tons of sterile topsoil and large rocks to get to the older, potentially gold-bearing gravels below. He'd work this claim for weeks, his daily take a pathetic pittance, clinging to the belief that the real treasure was just a little bit deeper. Eventually, he'd have to face the soul-crushing reality. The claim was a dud. He had just spent a month of his life and a significant portion of his health for nothing. So what now? He'd have to abandon it. But just as his spirit was about to break, a rumor would sweep through the camp like a wildfire. Someone had made a big strike up in a place called Last Chance Gulch, or some other poetically named canyon. Instantly, a new rush would begin. Silas, along with thousands of other disappointed men, would pack up his meager belongings and trek for miles over the rugged hills, a new surge of desperate optimism propelling him forward. He'd arrive at Last Chance Gulch only to find that the rumor was a lie, or that the good ground was already claimed by 1,000 other men who had heard the same story. All he had done was trade one patch of worthless dirt for another. His journey wasn't a march towards fortune. It was a frantic, lateral scramble from one failure to the next, forever chasing a finish line that was always moving. Why didn't he just leave? This is the question a sane, modern mind would ask. The answer is that he was trapped, caught in a hamster wheel powered by hope and debt. The most immediate trap was economic. Silas had likely spent every penny he had in the world just to get to California. He had sold his farm, mortgaged his future. He was now in debt to Jedediah, the camp merchant, for the very food he was eating. To leave now, with empty pockets, would be to return home in a state of utter, abject failure, a disgrace to his family and a cautionary tale for his entire town. He couldn't go home a beggar. So he had to keep digging, no longer with the dream of getting rich, but with the desperate, grim hope that he might, just might, break even. His life was also tethered to the grand, indifferent rhythms of the seasons, a cage forged by the climate. The dry season of late summer and fall brought its own special misery. With the rivers low, the rockers and sluices were useless. This forced him into coyoting, a terrifying practice of digging narrow, unsupported tunnels into the dry ravines, chasing a seam of gravel. It was claustrophobic, dark, and incredibly dangerous, with the constant threat of being buried alive. Then the rainy season would arrive in the winter, and the landscape would transform into an impassable sea of mud. The rivers would swell into raging monsters, and all work would cease. He would be trapped in his leaky tent for weeks on end, listening to the rain drum on the canvas, watching his food supply dwindle, and slowly going mad from the crushing boredom and confinement. Each season bled into the next, a relentless cycle of toil, flood, and frustration, with him as the perpetually exhausted human shuttle. There was no escape. It would be an insult to suggest that our 49er's life contained anything that could be genuinely labeled as joy. It was too grim, too brutal for such a civilized emotion. And yet, even in the deepest, darkest pit of daily misery, the human spirit, that stubborn, irrational weed, can sometimes find the tiniest, most improbable crack of light. These weren't moments of happiness. They were tiny, gasping breaths in an ocean of suffocation. There was that grim flicker of professional pride. The moment when a sluice box you spent 3 days building actually worked, the water flowing through it at the perfect angle, not a single drop leaking from the seams. There was a grim satisfaction in the perfect swing of a pickaxe, the clean crack as a stubborn rock split exactly the way you wanted it to. These were tiny victories of order and skill in a universe governed by chaos and luck. A small but vital affirmation that you were not merely a beast of burden, but a man who knew his craft. Sometimes, a shared joke, so dark it would make a gravedigger wince, would ripple between partners. A comment on a particularly unappetizing-looking piece of salt pork, or a sarcastic remark about the enormous size of the day's findings. This harsh, barking laughter was a weapon. It was a way of staring into the abyss of their collective failure and refusing to be broken by it. It was a moment of connection, a shared acknowledgement of the profound absurdity of their situation. And then, very rarely, there was a moment of pure, unadulterated awe. Perhaps Silas, after a grueling day, would climb out of the canyon, away from the noise and the stench. He'd sit on a ridge as the sun went down, and watch the evening light set the granite peaks of the high Sierras ablaze with color. For a single breathtaking minute, the landscape would cease to be his antagonist, and would reveal itself for what it was, a place of terrifying, sublime, and utterly indifferent beauty. The scale of it all, the vastness of the sky, the silence of the ancient mountains, would make his own grubby struggles seem pathetic and small. The moment wasn't comforting. It was clarifying. It was a brief, poignant glimpse of a world that existed before the rush, and would exist long after his bones were dust. These were not moments of happiness. They were tiny, gasping affirmations of existence in a life that was relentlessly trying to extinguish it. No one endures a life like this forever. The human body, for all its resilience, is ultimately a machine with a finite number of cycles. After a year, or 2, or 3, of being run at maximum output in the worst possible conditions, the machine that was Silas began to break down. The gold rush, like a cruel moneylender, always comes to collect its debts, and it collects them in flesh and bone. This wasn't a gentle aging process. It was a rapid, catastrophic system failure. The process of passing the torch for a 49er was rarely a heartwarming scene of a father handing a treasured family pickaxe to his son. Most men hadn't brought their families, and they wouldn't have wished this life upon their worst enemy, let alone their own child. No, the torch of California gold mining wasn't passed from man to man, but from man to machine. The era of the individual prospector, the rugged Argonaut with his pan and rocker, was a brilliant, desperate flash in the pan. What came next was bigger, louder, and infinitely more destructive. But before he was made obsolete by technology, Silas was first made obsolete by his own body. The daily aches and pains that had been his constant companions now deepened into crippling, permanent disabilities. The rheumatize in his joints graduated from a dull ache to a white-hot agony, his knuckles swelling into gnarled lumps that made gripping a shovel a feat of pure willpower. The miner's cough, once a minor annoyance from the dust and damp, now rattled his chest with a deep, wet rattle. It was the beginning of lung fever, pneumonia, or tuberculosis, a death sentence in a place with no medicine and no care. His back, a monument to prolonged abuse, would simply give out one morning, sending a bolt of lightning down his leg that left him unable to stand, let alone haul rocks. The bill for his miserable diet came due in the form of teeth that loosened and fell out, and a constitution so weakened that a common cold could put him in a shallow grave. The slow, dawning realization of his own obsolescence was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. He'd watch a new batch of greenhorns arrive in the diggings, their faces still full of foolish optimism, their bodies still intact. They moved faster, worked longer, and were fueled by the same delusional hope that had long since soured into cynical resignation in Silas's own heart. The younger men would start to outpace him, their shovels moving in a blur while his felt like it was cast from lead. He was becoming a ghost at the feast, a worn-out tool. Just as his body was failing, the very nature of gold mining was changing around him in a way that would have finished him even if he were in perfect health. The torch was being passed to hydraulic mining. This wasn't prospecting. It was warfare against the landscape. Companies, financed by San Francisco bankers, began building vast networks of dams and flumes, channeling the mountain rivers into giant canvas hoses tipped with massive iron nozzles called monitors. These were water cannons of terrifying power. With a single lever, a handful of men could unleash a torrent of water so powerful it could tear apart an entire hillside in minutes, dislodging trees, rocks, and dirt in a roaring, muddy avalanche. They would aim these cannons at the ancient gravel beds of the hills, the auriferous gravels the old-timers had only dreamed of reaching, and simply wash the entire landscape away. The resulting slurry of mud, rock, and water was directed into enormous, complex networks of sluices, some hundreds of feet long, that filtered out the gold on an industrial scale. The sound of it was a constant, deafening roar that echoed through the canyons for miles. For Silas, the lone prospector, this was the apocalypse. He could no more compete with a hydraulic mining operation than a man with a rowboat could compete with a steamship. His little 10-foot claim on the riverbank was worthless now anyway. The rivers themselves were being buried, choked with millions of tons of debris, the slickens washed down from the hydraulic mines upstream. The clear mountain streams he once panned were now thick, syrupy rivers of gray mud, the gold buried forever beneath 100 feet of industrial waste. The individual Argonaut was extinct. The torch had been passed to capital, to corporations, to a new kind of wage-earning miner who would never even pretend to be his own boss. So what became of Silas, the broken-down, obsolete prospector? What did the 49er pension plan look like? There were a few grim options. The first, and most ironic, was to go to work for the very companies that had destroyed his livelihood. He who had come to California to be a master of his own destiny could now be found earning $1 a day as a wage slave, digging ditches for the company flumes or breaking rocks for the giant sluices. He traded the tyranny of his own failed ambition for the tyranny of a foreman's whistle. His dream of a personal fortune reduced to earning just enough to buy his daily beans from the company store. A second option was to join the service economy of the camps. His dream of gold now dead, he might find work as a cook in a dirty canvas hotel, a mule skinner hauling supplies over the mountains, or a wood chopper, his ruined back screaming with every swing of the axe. He could become a bartender, pouring adulterated whiskey for the new generation of dreamers. His face a mask of bitter cynicism as he listened to them boast about the fortunes they were about to make. For those too physically broken for even these jobs, the path led further down. They became the drifters, the ghosts of the gold rush. They would wander from camp to camp, dressed in rags, begging for a flapjack or a cup of coffee, their eyes hollowed out by failure. The burgeoning cities of Sacramento and San Francisco began to fill up with these men, the living refuse of the gold fields, a constant, embarrassing reminder of the 99 who failed for everyone who succeeded. Some, in a final, desperate act of swallowing their pride, would try to make their way home. They would have to beg for passage on a ship or join a wagon train heading east, returning to the towns they left as conquering heroes, now arriving as broken, destitute failures, with nothing to show for their grand adventure but a hacking cough and a lifetime of nightmares. And for many, perhaps most, the final retirement plan was much simpler. It was a shallow, unmarked grave on a lonely hillside, having finally succumbed to disease, a drunken brawl, a mining accident, or simple starvation. This was the most common end for the 49er. He didn't pass a torch. He just had his own flame quietly, unceremoniously, snuffed out. History has a notoriously selective memory. It is drawn to the glittering exceptions, not the mundane, miserable rule. When we think of the California gold rush today, we remember the success stories. We remember Sam Brannan, the canny merchant who became California's first millionaire, not by digging, but by shouting gold in the streets of San Francisco and then selling shovels to the fools who believed him. We remember the Big Four, the railroad barons like Leland Stanford and Collis Huntington, who built vast fortunes upon the economic bedrock that the rush created. We remember the astonishing overnight birth of cities and the triumphant admission of California as the 31st state. These are the names carved in stone, the figures who stand atop the monumental obelisk of history. But beneath the shadow of that obelisk lies the unrecorded dust of 100,000 men. Men like Silas. He wore no crown, commanded no army, and his name appears in no ledger of accounts, save perhaps for the one in Jedediah's store, where he was listed as a debtor. He is the forgotten man, the anonymous ant who labored tirelessly to build the mountain upon which others would plant their flags. He, and the legions like him, were the true story of the gold rush. Their crushing individual failure was the raw material from which America's great national success was forged. Their suffering was the silent, unacknowledged mortgage payment on the California dream. And what a dream it was. For all his personal misery, the collective impact of Silas and his cohort was nothing short of world-changing. There is a profound and bitter irony in the fact that these men, who so spectacularly failed in their personal ambitions, succeeded on a scale they could never have imagined. They didn't just witness history. They physically, painfully, and accidentally created it. His legacy is hidden everywhere, in plain sight. It is in the very existence of California as we know it. The gold rush was a human tidal wave that crashed upon a remote and sparsely populated Mexican territory, and in less than 2 years, transformed it into a bustling American state. The lure of gold compressed 50 years of settlement into 24 months. The roads he desperately needed, the farms that sprang up to feed him their ruinously expensive potatoes, the ports that supplied his tools. This was the infrastructure of a new economic superpower being born. He came seeking personal wealth, but his frantic, disorganized labor was the unwitting act of nation building. His legacy echoed across the continent. The sheer weight of population and commerce in California made the idea of a transcontinental railroad not just a fantasy, but a geopolitical necessity. The great steel tracks that would finally bind the nation together were laid directly over the path of his desperate ambition. He was the human catalyst for the telegraph lines, the stagecoach routes, and the manifest destiny that drove America to the Pacific. He sought a small fortune, and in his failure, he gifted his country an empire. The consequences rippled even further. The hundreds of millions of dollars in gold that his broken body and others like it pulled from the earth were injected directly into the veins of the global economy. This massive influx of capital helped fuel the Industrial Revolution in the East, stabilized the finances of the Union on the eve of the Civil War, and altered the course of international trade. Silas, shivering and starving in some muddy canyon in the Sierras, had no idea that his pathetic pile of gold dust, when multiplied by 100,000, was propping up the Bank of England and financing factories in Manchester. He was a global economic force who couldn't afford a new pair of boots. So how do we remember him? He is not a hero. His motives were not noble. They were born of desperation and greed. He was often a participant in the brutal displacement of native peoples and the persecution of his fellow miners. But he was more than just a victim, more than a simple fool. He was a fundamental particle of history, an agent of a vast, chaotic, and transformative process. He was the human silt. Think of the hydraulic mines that came after him. They blasted away entire mountainsides with their water cannons, a process of incredible violence and destruction. All that mud, gravel, and water would be funneled through giant sluices that captured the tiny flakes of gold. The rest, the millions of tons of worthless rock, sand, and mud known as slickens, was simply washed down into the rivers, choking them, burying the landscape, and forming a new artificial foundation of earth. Silas was the human equivalent of that slickens. The great violent process of history that was the gold rush blasted apart his life, his health, and his dreams. It extracted the gold, the statehood, the national expansion, the economic boom, and he and the thousands like him were the debris. Their individual stories, their names, their hopes, and their unrecorded deaths were washed away. They became the anonymous human silt upon which the New World was built. Their legacy is not written in statues, but in the very foundation of the land they helped create and were consumed by. So, the next time you marvel at the enduring myth of the American West, or see a photograph of a grizzled, determined prospector, spare a thought for the forgotten man. He sought glory and received none. He sought a fortune and died in debt. Yet, in his unceasing labor, in his stubborn endurance against all odds, he was more than just a sufferer. He was the unseen engine that powered a civilization, the spark of friction that started a fire that remade a continent. His name is forgotten, but his collective, accidental, and tragic contribution is eternal.